When the heavy titanium bulkhead hissed open, releasing a blast of pressurized, freezing air from the subterranean vault, I realized my late wife had spent her final years executing a financial war from her deathbed. I am Leonard Vance, 70 years old, and until that moment, I was a broken man who believed he had lost everything. The high-stakes world of commercial real estate in Southern California once knew me as a builder who could look at a barren stretch of dirt and see a towering monument of steel and glass. I spent 35 years erecting landmarks across Los Angeles, negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, and navigating the ruthless waters of corporate property development. But none of those corporate battles could have prepared me for the devastating, cold-blooded betrayal that began in a sterile conference room on a gloomy Tuesday morning. It was exactly 3 weeks after I buried the love of my life, my beautiful wife, Eleanor. We had been married for 40 incredible years. 4 decades of shared dreams, building a massive real estate portfolio from scratch, and creating what I genuinely believed was a rock-solid, loving family. I had stepped down as the chairman of my development firm a few years prior, willingly walking away from the height of my career. I did it without a single regret, just so I could personally care for Eleanor during her final, grueling 2-year battle with terminal cancer. I loved her more than life itself, and I would have traded every single dollar of our wealth, every building, and every investment, just to have one more healthy day with her by my side. I was sitting in the freezing, glass-walled office of our longtime family estate attorney, Roger Baldwin. The room felt completely sterile and lifeless, devoid of any warmth. Across the heavy mahogany conference table sat my son Julian and his wife Gillian. They were both dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored designer clothing, looking more like they were preparing for an exclusive VIP gala than mourning the recent loss of a mother. Julian was checking his gold watch impatiently, while Gillian scrolled through her phone with a detached, bored expression. I sat there in my simple black suit, feeling the heavy, suffocating exhaustion of grief weighing down my old bones. I expected this reading of the will to be a simple, mundane formality. Eleanor and I had always discussed our estate planning together over morning coffee in our kitchen. I assumed the core assets, the property holdings, and the cash reserves would remain in my control to manage until my own time eventually came. After that, it was supposed to seamlessly pass down to Julian. That was the natural order of things, or so I believed. Roger Baldwin cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he looked down at the thick stack of legally binding documents. His voice was completely flat and monotonous, entirely detached from the emotional bomb he was about to detonate. He started by reading the clause regarding our primary residence, the $12 million luxury penthouse in downtown Los Angeles. I knew that property inside and out. I had paid for it in pure cash 10 years ago, designing every single square foot of it alongside Eleanor so it could be our perfect forever home, complete with panoramic views of the city skyline. Roger Baldwin stated clearly, reading the precise legal jargon without a single hint of hesitation, that full ownership and title of the Los Angeles penthouse was to be transferred immediately and solely to Julian and Gillian. I blinked hard, genuinely believing that my 70-year-old ears were playing a cruel trick on me. I waited for Roger Baldwin to correct himself, to mention my life estate, or at least my continued right to reside in the home I had built with my own hands. But he did not. He just kept reading, moving right past it, as if my 40 years of marriage and financial contributions meant absolutely nothing. And then he reached the portion of the will regarding my inheritance. According to the document, I, the man who had loved, protected, and provided for Eleanor every single day of her adult life, was left with nothing but an abandoned, rotting farm out in Ojai, California. It was a desolate, overgrown piece of property, a full 2 hours away from the city, a barren plot of dirt we had acquired years ago and completely forgotten about. I leaned forward slowly, my hands gripping the armrests of my leather chair so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I looked at Roger Baldwin, my voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of deep grief and absolute confusion. I asked him politely to stop reading, asking if there was some sort of clerical mistake, some drafting error that had accidentally swapped the names. Before Roger Baldwin could even open his mouth to answer my question, Julian lunged across the large mahogany table and violently snatched the legal documents right out of the attorney's hands. He let out a sharp, arrogant laugh that echoed off the cold glass walls of the office. In that single terrifying second, the mask of the grieving, supportive son completely vanished. He looked at me, and his eyes were filled with pure, unadulterated disdain. I will never forget the absolute coldness in his stare. "You heard the man, Dad," Julian said, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "The penthouse is ours now. There is no mistake. Mom finally saw things clearly before she died. She knew you were losing your edge, losing your mind. And frankly, a useless old man like you has no business living in a $12 million property." The room started spinning. The boy I had taught to ride a bike, the son I had proudly put through the finest business schools in America, the child I had sacrificed my own sleep to comfort when he was sick, was looking at me like I was a piece of garbage taking up space. I tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but the shock completely suffocated me. Julian leaned in closer, aggressively tapping the heavy legal paper against the polished wood table. "You need to go home, pack your bags, and be out of my property by 5 this evening," he demanded, narrowing his eyes. "Gillian and I are hosting a private dinner for some very important VIP clients tonight. We are closing a massive deal, and we absolutely do not have the time or the patience to deal with a senile old fool wandering around the living room and ruining our image." I was entirely numb. My chest ached with a pain far worse than any physical injury I had ever sustained. I do not even remember the long car ride back to the penthouse. I just remembered the deeply humiliating blur of throwing 40 years of my beautiful life into 2 small travel suitcases. I was forced to pack my most basic belongings while Julian's hired private security guards stood by the bedroom door, watching my every move as if I were a common thief. By 4:30 in the afternoon, I was standing in the grand marble hallway by the front elevators, literally being pushed out of the very home I had bought with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The heavy brass elevator doors chimed, ready to take me down to the lobby and out of their lives forever. Just as I grabbed the handle of my suitcase, feeling completely defeated, Gillian stepped out from the shadows of the corridor. She wore a sickening, victorious smirk that made my stomach churn. She reached into the pocket of her expensive designer blazer and shoved a small, unmarked prescription bottle roughly into my hand. "Eleanor's dying wish," Gillian whispered, leaning uncomfortably close to my ear so the security guards could not hear. "Take 2 a day for your heart, old man. Have a safe drive to nowhere." The heavy brass doors slid shut, sealing me out of the life I had built. I stood there in the polished marble hallway, the cold surface of the unmarked plastic bottle pressing into my palm. Gillian's cruel whisper echoed in my ears as I gripped the handle of my suitcase and made my way down to the underground parking garage. The descent felt like a funeral march. I found my beat-up Ford pickup truck parked between 2 gleaming European sports cars. It was a relic from my early days in construction, a truck I kept purely out of nostalgia and a stubborn refusal to forget where I came from. I tossed my bags onto the passenger seat and climbed behind the steering wheel. The leather was worn, smelling faintly of old coffee and sawdust. I sat there in the dim fluorescent lighting, staring at the small white pills inside the clear plastic container. There was no label, no dosage instructions, no pharmacy stamp, just smooth white tablets. My mind was racing, trying to process the absolute whiplash of the last 2 hours. Eleanor and I had built an empire together. We had shared every financial decision, every triumph, and every burden. How could she secretly draft a will that left me destitute while handing our crown jewel over to a son who looked at me with such venom? It did not make sense. Eleanor was a meticulous woman. She was a former forensic accountant who scrutinized every contract and every bank statement we ever signed. Leaving me with a decaying farm in Ojai and a bottle of mystery pills was completely contrary to the woman I had loved for 40 years. I needed answers. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at the screen. My thumb hovered over Julian's name. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in my hand, and pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times before the line clicked open. I expected him to bark at me, to ask why I was bothering him when he was busy preparing for his very important clients. Instead, I heard the faint clinking of expensive crystal glasses in the background and the soft murmur of unfamiliar voices. Then Julian spoke. The sheer hostility from the lawyer's office was completely gone. In its place was an overly warm, sickeningly sweet tone that sent a chill straight down my spine. "Dad," he said, his voice projecting loudly through the speakerphone. "I am so glad you called back. Gillian and I were just talking about you. Are you doing all right, Pop? Do you need us to call a car service to help you get out to the country?" I gripped the steering wheel, grinding my teeth. He was putting on a show. He was playing the role of the deeply concerned, loving son for his wealthy guests. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "What is going on? Why did your mother leave the penthouse to you? We built that home together, and what exactly are these pills?" Gillian shoved into my hand. Julian let out a soft, patronizing sigh, perfectly calibrated to sound like a man bearing the heavy burden of an aging parent. "Oh, Dad," he murmured sympathetically. "We talked about this at the lawyer's office. Remember, Mom did this to protect you. She knew you were struggling to keep up with things lately." I frowned completely, thrown off balance by his calm demeanor. Protect me by throwing me out on the street? Protect me by sending me to a rotting farmhouse 2 hours away from my doctors and my community? "Yes, Dad," Julian replied smoothly, his tone remarkably patient. "Think about it logically for a second. The property taxes and the homeowner association fees on this penthouse run close to $200,000 a year. You are 70 years old and living on a fixed retirement income. Now, if Mom had left this property in your name, the city and the banks would have drained your savings within a year. You would have gone bankrupt trying to maintain a $12 million asset all by yourself." I sat silently in the driver's seat, listening to the hum of the garage ventilation system. His words hit me like a splash of cold water. From a strictly financial perspective, it made a brutal kind of sense. Eleanor had always been ruthlessly pragmatic about taxes and asset protection. Could she have made a cold, calculated decision to preserve my small cash reserves by offloading the massive liability of the penthouse onto Julian? "Have peace and quiet in Ojai," Julian continued softly, leaning into the silence. "She wanted you to spend your golden years away from the smog and the noise of the city, resting on a quiet piece of land. And those pills, Dad, please do not be stubborn about them. You know your memory has been slipping lately. You have been forgetting names, misplacing your keys, getting confused during conversations. Mom was terrified about your cognitive decline. She spent a fortune having those high-end Swiss cognitive supplements special ordered for you before she passed. She made Gillian promise to make sure you took them. 2 a day, just like she wanted. Please take them, Dad. For Mom." I closed my eyes. Was I really losing my mind? Had my grief made me paranoid, turning my own son into a villain simply because I was hurt by a practical financial decision? I did not have the energy to fight him anymore. I told him I would call him when I arrived in Ojai and ended the call. I sat in the dim, cold light of the truck cabin for a very long time. The hum of the parking garage's ventilation system was the only sound keeping me company. The logic of Julian's argument slowly settled into my tired, grief-stricken brain. It was a harsh, bitter pill to swallow, but perhaps they were right. Perhaps my grief had made me paranoid, turning my own son and daughter-in-law into villains simply because I was hurt by a practical, tax-saving financial decision. After all, I was 70 years old. I had been under immense stress for the last 2 years, watching the woman I loved slowly fade away. I had forgotten my keys last week. I had misplaced my glasses twice. Maybe my mind really was starting to fail me. During those grueling months in the hospital room, Eleanor had been my entire world. I had watched her, once so vibrant and sharp, fade into a shadow of herself. The cancer had eaten away at her body, and towards the end, the doctors had pumped her full of heavy narcotics to manage the pain. In those dark hours, I had felt my own strength slipping. Grief does terrible things to an old man's confidence. It makes you second-guess your own senses, your own memories. As I sat in the truck, Julian's voice kept echoing in my head, telling me that Mom had done this to protect me. I wondered if I really had been showing signs of decline. The doubt was a slow poison, eating away at my resolve until I actually began to believe my son's lies. With a heavy sigh, I popped the cap off the clear plastic bottle. I tapped a single smooth white tablet into my calloused palm. It looked completely harmless, clean, and clinical. I swallowed it dry, washing it down with a quick sip of lukewarm water from a plastic bottle sitting in my cup holder. I started the engine, put the worn gear shift of my Ford pickup into drive, and slowly rolled out of the underground garage, leaving my entire life behind. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon as I merged onto the Pacific Coast Highway. The sky was painted in deep oranges and purples, a beautiful California sunset that would have taken Eleanor's breath away. Usually, the rhythmic sound of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs brought me a deep sense of peace. Today, however, the sound felt incredibly distant, as if I were listening to it through a thick wall of water. The traffic was heavy as I crawled out of the city limits, the headlights of commuting cars starting to flicker on around me. The Pacific Coast Highway is beautiful, but it is also unforgiving. The road clings tightly to the cliffs, with nothing but a thin guardrail separating the asphalt from a 100-foot drop into the rocky Pacific Ocean. Under normal circumstances, I drove this route with absolute focus. But as the truck rolled north, passing the familiar landmarks of Malibu, a strange metallic taste began to coat the back of my tongue. It was sharp and chemical, like a battery leaking acid. I swallowed hard, trying to rid myself of the taste, but it only grew stronger. At the same time, the heater in my truck, which had been blowing warm air, suddenly felt ice cold. I reached out to adjust the dial, but my hand felt heavy, as if I were moving it through thick syrup. About 40 minutes into the winding drive along the coast, the world outside my windshield began to warp in a terrifying way. The bright orange sky began to smear like a wet oil painting. The headlights of the cars in front of me turned into long, blinding streaks of light that danced across my vision. A sudden ice-cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and my hands started shaking so violently that I could barely maintain my grip on the worn leather steering wheel. A wave of intense nausea hit my stomach. I tried to take a deep breath, but my lungs refused to expand. It felt like my chest was being filled with heavy, wet cement. My heart, which had been pounding from the stress of the wheel reading, suddenly slowed down to a sluggish, irregular crawl. I checked my pulse with one hand, my fingers feeling completely numb and unresponsive. My heart rate was dropping dangerously low. "What is happening to me?" I whispered, my voice sounding like a raspy gasp in the quiet cabin. I blinked rapidly, trying to force the heavy fog out of my eyes, but the darkness was closing in from the edges of my vision. The truck began to drift toward the double yellow lines. A horn blared loudly to my left as an oncoming sedan swerved to avoid me. The near collision sent a jolt of panic through my system, but my reflexes were completely shot. My body felt like it was made of lead. I knew that if I did not stop the truck immediately, I would drive straight off the coastal cliffs and plunge into the crashing ocean below. Using the absolute last ounce of my physical strength, I slammed my boot onto the brake pedal. The tires screamed against the asphalt as the truck lurched violently. I yanked the steering wheel to the right, jerking the heavy pickup onto the narrow gravel shoulder of the highway. The truck bounced over the rough dirt, kicking up a cloud of dust before coming to a sudden, jarring halt. I tried to reach for my phone in my pocket to call for help, but my fingers could not grasp the fabric. The plastic pill bottle on the passenger seat caught my eye one last time, rolling slowly against my leather briefcase. Then, the heavy darkness swallowed me whole, and the world faded into absolute nothingness. I woke up with a sudden, violent gasp, my lungs burning as if I had been submerged underwater for hours. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles aching from holding the worn leather in a death grip even while unconscious. The truck cabin was completely dark, save for the faint dashboard lights illuminating the heavy beads of cold sweat rolling down my forehead. I blinked rapidly, trying to force my eyes to focus through the thick, unnatural fog that had taken over my mind. My heart was pounding against my ribs, an erratic, terrifying rhythm that felt entirely wrong. I checked the dashboard clock. The glowing digits read 7:12 p.m. I had been unconscious on the gravel shoulder of the highway for over 3 hours. I rolled down the window with a shaking hand, letting the freezing ocean breeze hit my face. The crisp, salty air acted like a physical slap, slowly pulling my senses back from the brink of the narcotic abyss. I took deep, shuddering breaths, feeling the ice-cold air clear the chemical haze in my brain. I am 70 years old, but I spent 35 years as a commercial real estate developer in one of the most competitive markets in the world. My entire career was built on spotting discrepancies, identifying hidden risks, and reading people who were desperately trying to hide the truth. You don't survive 3 decades in that business by being naive. As I leaned back against the headrest, closing my eyes, the puzzle pieces violently snapped together with terrifying clarity. Julian and Gillian did not care about my cognitive health. They did not care about my memory or my grief. Those smooth white tablets were not high-end Swiss supplements ordered by my late wife. They were heavy, dangerous sedatives, or perhaps something even more lethal. They had deliberately handed me unmarked narcotics right before I merged onto a treacherous, winding coastal highway. If my reflexes had been even a fraction of a second slower, if my truck had drifted just a few feet further to the right, I would have plummeted off the steep cliffs and into the dark ocean below. It would have been the perfect crime. It would have looked like a tragic, unfortunate accident. A grieving, senile old man, driven mad by loss and suffering from cognitive decline, losing control of his vehicle on a dangerous stretch of road. The media would have reported it as a sad end to a long career, and Roger Baldwin would have quietly processed the estate paperwork. Julian and Gillian would have stepped forward as the grieving heirs, crying public tears while privately popping champagne in their new $12 million penthouse. A surge of pure, hot anger washed over me, burning away the remaining chemical fog in my mind. It was a cold, focused fury, the kind I hadn't felt in years. They had underestimated me. They thought my age made me weak, that my grief had made me stupid. They thought they could sweep me aside like a piece of useless trash. I reached into the passenger seat, my trembling fingers finding the unmarked plastic bottle. I gripped it tightly, feeling the cold, clinical plastic against my palm. I popped the driver's side door open, stepped out onto the gravel shoulder, and with a furious yell, hurled the bottle as hard as I could into the pitch-black abyss of the ocean. I stood there, listening to the small plastic container clatter against the jagged rocks below before disappearing forever into the roaring, crashing waves. I climbed back into the cab, slammed the door shut, and gripped the gear shift. My hands were still shaking, but it was no longer from the drugs. It was from the raw adrenaline of a survivor. I was no longer a confused, grieving widower mourning the natural loss of his wife. I was a man who had just survived an attempted execution by his own flesh and blood. I started the engine. The Ford pickup rumbled to life, a steady, mechanical growl that felt like a reassuring companion in the dark. I pulled the truck back onto the highway, tires crunching over the gravel before gripping the asphalt. I left the ocean behind, navigating the truck inland through Ventura. The bright city lights quickly faded, replaced by the towering, dark silhouettes of the mountains as I turned onto the winding canyon road leading into the Ojai Valley. The road was empty, a ribbon of black asphalt cut into the side of the cliffs. My headlights flickered against the dry brush and the ancient oak trees, casting long, dancing shadows into the darkness. I drove in absolute silence, the radio off, my mind working with a sharp, cold efficiency. I was heading to Ojai. I was going to find out exactly why Eleanor had left me that rotting farm, and what secrets were waiting for me in the dark. Eleanor had been a forensic accountant for the federal government before we met. She was the kind of woman who could look at a massive corporation's balance sheets and trace a missing $5 transaction through 10 different offshore accounts. She loved order. She loved logic. She used to tell me that numbers never lie, but the people who write them always do. As I drove through the dark canyon, her words echoed in my head. There was no way a woman like that would leave a messy, useless asset like a rotting farm to her husband unless it served a specific, logical purpose. There was a reason she kept that land hidden from Julian. There was a reason she wrote that will, and I was going to uncover it. By the time my GPS indicated I was approaching the property, the sun had fully dipped below the mountain ridgeline, casting long, eerie shadows across the valley. I turned off the paved 2-lane road and onto a rugged dirt driveway. The entrance was almost completely hidden, choked with overgrown weeds, wild mustard, and dry brambles that clawed at the sides of my truck. The branches of dying oak trees scraped aggressively against the metal cab as I crept forward in low gear. It felt like I was driving into a forgotten world. After about 1 mile of slow, bumpy crawling, the dense tree line finally broke, revealing the Ojai property Eleanor had left me. I shifted the truck into park and stared through the dusty windshield. It looked like a setting from a cheap horror movie. The main farmhouse was a decaying 2-story wooden structure that had long since lost its battle with the elements. The front porch roof had completely caved in, crushing the wooden steps. The siding was warped and rotting, covered in peeling gray paint, and every single window was either boarded up with weathered plywood or shattered into jagged shards of glass. A rusted, decades-old John Deere tractor sat abandoned in the side yard, swallowed by tall wild grass. It was a desolate, depressing wasteland. "This is the peace and quiet Julian was so smugly talking about," I muttered to myself, a bitter taste in my mouth. A property so worthless and isolated that no one would ever come looking for me. I stepped out of the truck, the crunch of dry gravel echoing loudly in the absolute stillness of the valley. The air here was entirely different from the coast. It was dry, cold, and quiet, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and eucalyptus. I reached behind the driver's seat and grabbed my heavy metal Maglite flashlight, its solid weight comforting in my hand. I clicked it on, a bright beam of white light cutting through the encroaching darkness. I walked toward the farmhouse, my developer instincts immediately kicking to life. In my 35 years in commercial real estate, I had inspected over 500 properties. I could walk onto a construction site and tell you within 5 minutes if the foundation was solid or if we were pouring money down a structural drain. Evaluating properties was practically woven into my DNA. I swept the flashlight beam over the cracked concrete footings of the farmhouse. The building had settled severely to the east, indicating major soil failure. The main support beams were bowed, and I could see deep water damage and active dry rot running along the sill plates. Termite tubes climbed up the side of the decaying wood. The house was beyond repair. It was a complete teardown, a liability that would cost more to demolish than the land itself was worth. As I stood there, shining the light on the rotting porch, a massive contradiction began to bother me. There was absolutely no logical reason for Eleanor to hold on to a dead property like this for over 10 years. Eleanor was a brilliant forensic accountant who managed our family assets with ruthless mathematical precision. She hated dead assets. She hated paying property taxes on useless land that generated zero income. She lived by a strict financial code, often telling me, "Leonard, an asset that doesn't produce is just a liability in disguise." Why would a woman who scrutinized every single decimal point secretly keep this ruin? And why would she specifically single it out to be my sole inheritance, bypassing Julian entirely? It made zero financial sense, unless the farmhouse was not the real asset. I turned away from the decaying house and began walking toward the back of the property. The plot extended far back into a dense cluster of towering eucalyptus and oak trees. As I moved away from the ruins of the main house, my boots crunching over dead branches and scattered debris, I noticed something strange. I stopped dead in my tracks. I lowered my flashlight, shining the bright beam directly onto the dirt path. The driveway leading up to the main farmhouse was covered in years of untouched, overgrown brush, showing that no passenger vehicle had driven up it in ages. But the path leading past the side of the house, curving toward the dense trees out back, was entirely different. I crouched down in the dirt, placing my hand on the ground. The earth here was deeply compacted and heavily rutted. These were not the shallow tracks of a lost hiker's vehicle or a local teenager's pickup. These were fresh, deep, heavy-duty truck tire tracks. I recognized the dual rear-wheel tread patterns. These tracks were made by commercial utility vehicles carrying massive payloads. I swept my flashlight along the path. There were dozens of these tracks overlapping each other in the mud, indicating frequent and recent traffic. Someone had created a clear, heavily used road right through the middle of this supposed wasteland. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. The narrative Julian had spun at the lawyer's office, the story of a useless, rotting farm meant to give a senile old man a quiet place to die, was falling apart right beneath my feet. There was something happening at the back of this property. Something massive, active, and highly secretive. I gripped my heavy flashlight tighter and followed the muddy tire tracks deeper into the dark trees. The dark path wound deeper into the dense grove of ancient trees, leaving the decaying farmhouse behind. The dry eucalyptus leaves rattled loudly in the cold wind, a sharp paper-like sound that kept my nerves on edge. The canopy of oak branches was so thick it completely blocked out the silver moonlight, leaving me entirely dependent on the bright beam of my maglite. With every step, my work boots sank slightly into the mud, following the deep, compacted tire tracks. I kept my breathing shallow, my senses fully alert. In the absolute isolation of the Ojai Valley, any sound, a snapping twig, a rustling animal, seemed to echo for miles. After walking for about 300 yards, the trees suddenly parted, revealing a massive structure situated at the very back of the lot. I stopped and swept my flashlight over the building. It was a large corrugated metal barn, easily 80 feet long and 40 feet wide. At first glance, the exterior looked just as neglected and decaying as the main farmhouse. The metal siding was covered in patches of orange rust, the paint was faded and peeling, and dirt was caked along the base. It blended in perfectly with the desolate, ruined landscape, but as I stepped closer, my developer instincts flared again. I shined my flashlight at the corners of the building. The metal walls were straight and true, with no sag or warping. More importantly, the building did not rest on simple wooden skids or dry-stacked stone, as old barns typically do. It sat on a thick, professionally poured concrete slab foundation. The concrete was clean, with clean expansion joints and no settling cracks. This was not a cheap, historical farm structure. This was a modern, heavy-duty commercial warehouse disguised as a ruin. Then, my flashlight beam caught something metallic hidden in the low branches of a towering oak tree near the side of the barn. I stepped closer, pushing the wet branches aside. Running down the side of an old wooden utility pole was a thick, black electrical conduit. I followed the line with my flashlight as it swooped down from a massive utility transformer mounted high on the pole, entering the side of the barn through a heavy-duty weatherhead. It was not a standard residential electrical hookup. It was a brand new, industrial-grade 3-phase power line. In commercial real estate development, you learn everything there is to know about utility infrastructure. You learn that running electricity is one of the most expensive parts of a project. Standard residential homes in California operate on split-phase 120, 240-volt power, which is more than enough to run lights, appliances, and air conditioning. But three-phase power is entirely different. It delivers 480 volts of continuous, high-efficiency electrical current. You only run three-phase power lines when you need to support heavy manufacturing equipment, massive industrial refrigeration units, or high-density computer server farms. Furthermore, installing an industrial-grade power grid like this in a remote rural area like the Ojai Valley is not something you do overnight. It requires extensive utility company permits, dedicated easement approvals, and easily $50,000 to $60,000 in upfront installation costs. You do not install industrial power grids into an abandoned, rotting barn in the middle of nowhere. Not unless you are running a massive, high-powered operation in secret. I lowered my flashlight, stepping right up to the massive sliding metal doors of the barn. I reached out and pressed my palm flat against the cold, corrugated steel. The air around the structure felt different. There was a faint, almost imperceptible, low-frequency hum vibrating through the steel and into the concrete ground beneath my boots. It was a deep, rhythmic thrumming, the distinct sound of industrial ventilation systems and high-powered cooling fans running somewhere deep inside the structure. Someone was drawing a massive amount of electricity into this barn right now. My mind was spinning with a dozen different questions. Why had Eleanor secretly spent tens of thousands of dollars to run three-phase industrial power out to this remote, forgotten farm? What was humming behind these metal doors? And how did this tie back to the luxury penthouse in Los Angeles, the suspicious will reading, and the bottle of sedatives Julian and Gillian had given me? It was too dangerous to stand out in the open in the dark, trying to force entry into a building that was clearly part of a highly secured operation. If Julian's security detail had followed me, I was a sitting duck out here in the woods. I needed to get inside the main house immediately. I needed to find a secure, lockable space where I could sit down, think, and process the sheer magnitude of the anomalies I had just uncovered. I turned away from the humming barn and slowly retraced my steps through the dark trees, my boots squelching in the mud as I headed back toward the rotting farmhouse. I approached the wooden porch of the farmhouse, each step groaning under my weight, and forcefully pushed open the front door. The severely rusted hinges shrieked violently into the quiet Ojai night, sounding eerily like a dying animal screaming in the dark. I stepped inside and swept the bright beam of my maglite across the desolate living room. The interior smelled intensely of stale dust, damp plaster spreading dry rot, and countless years of absolute unforgiving neglect. The faded floral wallpaper was peeling off the plaster walls in long, yellowed strips that hung like dead skin. The uneven floorboards warped and groaned loudly under my feet. There was a single tattered armchair sitting perfectly in the center of the dark room, covered by a thin cotton sheet that had turned a sickly gray color with age. I reached out, grabbed the sheet, and pulled it away. A thick cloud of dust particles erupted into the air, dancing like tiny floating stars in the bright beam of my flashlight. I coughed, waved the dust away, and sank heavily into the worn, lumpy cushions. My mind was spinning relentlessly. The industrial-grade three-phase power line, the fresh tire tracks in the mud, the concrete slab foundation, and the completely uncharacteristic behavior of Eleanor. Absolutely none of it made any logical sense. Yet all these hidden clues pointed directly to something massive, expensive, and highly secretive being concealed right here on this forgotten piece of land. Before I could even begin to piece together a rational theory, the sudden shrill ringing of my cell phone violently shattered the dead silence of the farmhouse. I flinched physically, my tired heart jumping directly into my throat. The digital noise was deafening in the empty, echoing room. I quickly pulled the phone from my jacket pocket, fully expecting to see Roger Baldwin calling to finalize some leftover legal paperwork from the will reading. Instead, the bright glowing screen displayed a name that instantly made my blood run entirely cold. It was Gillian. Why on earth would my cruel daughter-in-law be calling me now, deep into the evening? Every single survival instinct I had painstakingly developed over 3 decades in the cutthroat commercial real estate industry screamed at me not to answer. In business, when a predator calls you after a hostile takeover, you hang up, but a deeper, much more strategic voice in my head firmly told me to answer. I needed to know exactly what she wanted. I needed to know if they were monitoring my movements. In a commercial negotiation, if you let your opponent know what you know, you lose the deal. But if you play the fool, they always show their cards. I cleared my throat, forcing my tense facial muscles to relax, and slowly swiped the green button to accept the call. I brought the phone to my ear, keeping my voice soft, weak, and tired. "Hello?" I muttered. "Dad? Oh, thank goodness you finally answered." Gillian's voice came rushing through the receiver. Her vocal tone was completely unrecognizable to me. The venomous, icy condescension from the luxury penthouse hallway was entirely gone. In its place was an overly sweet, highly frantic level of concern. Her voice was pitched artificially high, fluttering with a feigned dramatic anxiety that made my skin crawl. "Did you make it there safely? We've been so worried about you," she cooed. "Yes, Gillian," I slurred, intentionally dragging out my syllables. "I made it. I am currently inside the farmhouse." "Oh, I am so incredibly relieved," she continued, speaking entirely too fast. "Listen, Dad, I was just wondering, have you walked around the outer property yet? Do you happen to go into the old barn out back? Eleanor always talks so fondly about that barn. Did you open the big doors?" The aggressive specificity of her rapid-fire questions hit me like a physical blow. She did not actually care if I had survived the drive. She did not care about my grief or my displacement. She only cared about the barn. The very same barn secretly connected to a massive industrial power grid. I knew instantly that this phone call was a trap. If I told her the truth, if I told her I saw the fresh tire tracks and the thick electrical cables, I would be signing my own death warrant. I needed to make her believe that their plan had worked flawlessly. I needed her to believe that I was exactly what Julian had called me, a senile, useless old man who posed zero threat. I slouched deep into the dusty armchair, let out a low, pathetic groan, and slurred my words heavily. "No, Gillian," I mumbled weakly, forcing my vocal cords to tremble. "I didn't go outside, it's too dark. I'm so incredibly tired right now. Those special pills you gave me, they made me so dizzy on the road. My vision is entirely blurred right now. I can barely stand up straight. I just dragged myself into the living room and collapsed into a chair. I think I'm going to sleep for a week. I can't even think about walking out into the dark to explore some old barn." There was a sharp, sudden, and highly calculating pause on the other end of the line. I could distinctly hear the quiet hiss of her breathing as she processed my words, evaluating whether I was telling the truth. When she finally spoke again, the frantic, desperate edge in her voice had completely vanished. In its place was a smooth, chillingly dark satisfaction. "Oh, Dad, I am so sorry. The long drive must have taken so much out of you," she cooed softly. "You just rest now. Do not worry about exploring the property tonight. Just stay securely inside the house and sleep deeply. We will talk again in a few days. Goodbye." The line went dead. I lowered the silent phone slowly, staring blankly into the dark, empty room. The terrifying pieces were finally locking into place. The mystery pills were specifically meant to incapacitate me, to keep me out of the way, or perhaps to make sure I never woke up at all. They wanted me helpless tonight, and if Gillian was this desperate to know if I had entered the barn, it meant there was something incredibly valuable hidden inside it that they needed. Something they were willing to drug me to protect. I stood there in the silent, pitch-black living room, the dead phone still clutched in my hand. The terrifying pieces of the puzzle were finally locking into place. The mystery pills Gillian had shoved into my hand weren't meant to protect my health. They were meant to completely neutralize me. They wanted me to be physically helpless tonight. If Gillian was so desperately concerned about whether or not I had entered that specific barn out back, it meant there was something incredibly valuable hidden inside it that she and my treacherous son Julian desperately needed. And they needed it tonight, before anyone else discovered it. I walked slowly across the loudly creaking floorboards, moving quietly toward the front of the farmhouse. The large bay window in the front living room was heavily covered in decades of thick grime, dust, and spiderwebs, featuring several large, dangerous cracks running diagonally through the fragile glass. I carefully leaned in, pressing my forehead against a relatively clean section of the cold pane, and looked out into the expansive, overgrown front yard. The bright moon had finally risen over the ridgeline, casting a pale silver glow over the silent valley. The dark night was incredibly still, almost peaceful, but my instincts were screaming that the silence was just a precursor to a storm. I scanned the distant horizon, actively searching for any sign of movement along the rugged, winding dirt road that led all the way back to the main highway. At first, there was absolutely nothing out there but the gentle swaying of the dry wild mustard and oak branches moving in the cold wind. But then, my sharp developer eyes caught something moving in the far distance. About 1 mile down the rugged, uneven dirt driveway, two bright, glaring headlights forcefully pierced through the thick darkness. A large vehicle was steadily approaching the isolated property, bouncing violently over the deep ruts and compacted dirt. I held my breath, watching the lights intently. Suddenly, the bright headlights snapped off entirely, plunging the approaching vehicle into total, absolute darkness. But the vehicle did not stop. The faint, highly rhythmic crunch of heavy tires rolling aggressively over loose gravel continued echoing in the silent night. I squinted through the cracked glass, trying to make out any details of the vehicle. It was a customized Chevrolet Suburban, painted in a flat, matte black that absorbed the silver moonlight rather than reflecting it. There was no chrome trim, no license plates, and the windows were heavily tinted to block out any view of the passengers inside. The lack of plates was a clear indication that this was an illegal operation. They didn't want any cameras or witnesses tracking their vehicle back to Los Angeles. This was a professional crew, and their silent, unmoving presence was terrifying. The massive black vehicle rolled to a silent stop near the edge of the overgrown gravel driveway. barely 100 yards from the decaying front porch, where I stood hidden behind the cracked glass. The engine was cut immediately. The taillights did not flash, the interior lights did not turn on. The vehicle sat there in the dark, a large dark silhouette observing the farmhouse, waiting for a response. They had not come all this way just to check on my physical well-being. They had come to violently finish the job. My immediate urge was to dial 911, to beg the local authorities to send a patrol car to this remote address. But my thumb hovered over the keypad and I stopped. I forced myself to think logically. Julian was not just a greedy, entitled son anymore. He was a highly connected, wealthy corporate executive who routinely rubbed elbows with local politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials. He funded political campaigns across Southern California. If I called the local police in a panic, claiming my son had sent hitmen to a remote farm, it was entirely possible the responding officers were already on his payroll. Or worse, they would simply write me off as a delusional, senile old man suffering from a severe cognitive breakdown, exactly the narrative Julian and Gillian had been carefully planting. Furthermore, Ojai was a rural area. The nearest Ventura County Sheriff's substation was a full 25 minutes away over winding mountain roads. Even if I did call them, and even if they weren't somehow connected to Julian's corporate interests, the response time alone would be too slow. If those men decided to breach the house, they would be inside within 2 minutes. By the time a patrol car rolled up the dirt driveway, it would be all over. My survival depended on my own actions. And on Walter. I could not risk placing my life in the hands of strangers who might be bought and paid for. I needed someone I could trust implicitly. I needed someone who knew how to handle a violent, life-threatening situation in the dead of night. I scrolled quickly past the emergency numbers on my phone and found the contact for Walter Higgins. Walter Higgins was a man who had seen the worst of humanity. We had met in 1982 when I was building a commercial complex in San Diego, and he was a young Marine sergeant stationed at Camp Pendleton. Over the next 40 years, our lives had taken different paths, but our bond had remained unbroken. Walter had served in combat zones across the globe, from the jungles of Panama to the desert streets of Fallujah, before retiring to run a private security consultancy. He knew how to read a battlefield, and more importantly, he knew how to neutralize threats without leaving a trace. If Walter said he would be here in 20 minutes, he would break every speed limit in California to make it. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, keeping my breathing shallow and my eyes locked on the dark SUV outside. The line rang only 2 times before his deep, gravelly voice answered. "Leonard," he said, alert. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. "Walter," I whispered into the receiver, my voice trembling slightly. "I am in serious trouble. I am out at the old Ojai property Eleanor left me. There is a black SUV parked right outside the tree line, operating entirely in stealth mode. They killed their headlights before pulling up, and they are just sitting there." There was absolute silence on the other end of the line for a fraction of a second. Walter did not ask if I was joking. He did not ask if I was overreacting to the shadows. He simply processed the tactical information instantly. "Give me your exact coordinates, Leonard," he said, his tone shifting into icy military efficiency. I recited the address from memory, my eyes never leaving the dark vehicle outside. "I am 20 minutes away if I push the engine," Walter replied. "Do not engage them under any circumstances. Keep your phone silent. Stay out of sight and find a heavy weapon just in case they breach the perimeter before I arrive." "I am on my way." I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket and slowly backed away from the front window. I placed each footstep with agonizing care, landing on the outer edges of my boots to avoid the loudest creaks in the weathered pine floorboards. In the darkness, the farmhouse felt like a giant hollow drum, ready to amplify the slightest sound. I moved silently through the narrow, dark hallway toward the rear of the house, letting my memory of the simple floor plan guide my movements. The kitchen had been abandoned for years, a relic of a time when this farm was still active. The yellowed linoleum floor was peeling up in the corners, exposing the raw plywood subfloor beneath. A heavy rusted cast-iron stove sat in the corner, cold and dead. The wind whistled through a cracked window pane, creating a low, eerie sigh that matched the groaning of the house. I had to ignore the drafts and the dust, forcing my eyes to adjust to the dim moonlight. The kitchen was a desolate, freezing space. Bathed in the pale moonlight, filtering through a dirty, cracked window over the sink, it looked like a tomb. I ran my hands over the decaying, water-damaged countertops, opening a few rusted drawers. They were empty, containing nothing but brittle wood shavings and ancient dust. Then, my foot brushed against something solid and metallic resting on the linoleum floor near the back door, hidden under a pile of old burlap sacks. I crouched down and swept my hand over the rough fabric, my fingers wrapping around a heavy iron crowbar. It was about 24 inches long, covered in surface rust and flakes of old green paint, but it was solid, forged steel. It had a heavy, comfortable weight, and as I gripped it, I felt a sudden surge of adrenaline flood my tired muscles. I was 70 years old, grieving and exhausted, but I was absolutely not going to lie down and let my ungrateful son order my execution without putting up a brutal, bloody fight. The crowbar felt like a physical extension of my anger, a tool of survival. I pressed my back against the kitchen wall and carefully reached for the tarnished brass handle of the rear door. It was stiff, resisting my grip, but I applied slow, steady pressure until the latch finally clicked open with a barely audible metallic pop. I eased the door open just wide enough to slip my body through the narrow gap, stepping quietly out into the freezing night air. The backyard was heavily overgrown with thick, chest-high wild mustard and tall, dead grass, providing me with excellent natural cover. I crouched down low, letting the dense vegetation conceal my silhouette, and slowly maneuvered my way around the side of the house toward the front driveway. I moved with agonizing caution, ensuring my heavy work boots did not snap any dry twigs or rustle the dry leaves. When I finally reached the corner of the rotting wooden porch, I peered carefully through the branches of an overgrown juniper bush. The doors of the black SUV quietly swung open. Two men stepped out onto the gravel. They were not common street thugs or cheap local criminals. They were dressed in high-end, professional black tactical gear from head to toe. They wore heavy Kevlar plate carriers, dark combat utility pants, and black balaclava masks that completely covered their faces, leaving only their cold, calculated eyes visible. In their hands, they carried sleek black submachine guns equipped with long, cylindrical sound suppressors. These men were highly trained, heavily armed professionals. They moved with terrifying, synchronized military precision, communicating entirely through subtle hand signals. Their movements were completely devoid of hesitation or noise. One of the men reached into a tactical utility pouch on his chest and pulled out a complex electronic device. Even from my hidden vantage point, I recognized the distinct, glowing green interface of a biometric bypass scanner. In my line of work, we frequently built high-security commercial bank branches and secure research facilities for defense contractors in Los Angeles. I had consulted with top-tier security analysts who had explained the mechanics of biometric bypass scanners. These devices were extremely rare, costing upwards of $15,000 on the black market, and were designed to intercept and override encrypted digital security protocols. Seeing that device in the hands of these men told me everything I needed to know. Julian hadn't just hired local street thugs or cheap private investigators. He had hired professional mercenaries, corporate espionage experts, or enforcers from a serious criminal syndicate. This was a high-stakes, black-budget operation. My heart hammered against my ribs, but a sudden, baffling realization made me freeze. The two armed men did not turn toward the front porch of the farmhouse. They did not even glance at the broken, boarded-up windows where they supposedly believed I was sleeping off a heavy dose of narcotics. Instead, they completely bypassed the residential structure entirely. They turned their backs to the farmhouse, raised their suppressed weapons to a ready position, and began marching silently through the muddy grass. They were heading directly towards the massive corrugated metal barn at the far edge of the property. They were completely ignoring me. They didn't care about my body, and they didn't care about confirming my death. They were going straight for whatever Eleanor had secretly hidden behind those heavy metal doors. I tightened my grip on the rusted iron crowbar, my breathing shallow and controlled. I waited until they were about 50 yards ahead, their dark figures blending into the shadows of the eucalyptus trees, before I stepped out from the dense juniper brush. I lowered my center of gravity and began to follow them into the darkness, stepping precisely in the muddy footprints they left behind to avoid making a single sound. As I crept through the dark, the freezing mud of the path soaked through the seams of my leather work boots. The cold wind bit into the back of my neck, freezing the sweat that had broken out during my escape from the house. It was a bizarre, surreal contrast. Just 6 hours ago, I was sitting in a warm attorney's office in a tailored suit, dealing with family wills and real estate contracts. Now, I was stalking two heavily armed tactical operators through the dark woods of a ruined farm, holding nothing but a rusted crowbar. My heart was pounding, but my mind was incredibly focused. I kept my eyes locked on the faint green LED lights glowing on the back of their tactical vests, moving only when they moved. The distance between me and the two armed intruders slowly shrank. 50 yards became 30, and then, with agonizing slowness, 15. They were standing directly in front of the massive, corrugated metal doors of the barn, their dark silhouettes illuminated only by the faint green glow of the biometric bypass scanner. They were mounting onto the steel frame. They communicated in hushed, clipped whispers that were immediately swallowed by the howling wind. One of the operators was adjusting the wiring of the scanning device, while the other stood slightly back, his suppressed submachine gun raised to a ready position, slowly scanning the dark tree line. I crouched behind the massive, rusted rear tire of an abandoned John Deere tractor, my breathing shallow and controlled. My grip on the rusted iron crowbar was so tight, my forearms were cramping painfully. I was 70 years old. I was in decent physical shape for my age. But pitting myself against two highly trained tactical professionals in their physical prime was practically suicide. Yet, the thought of Julian sending hired killers to execute me in my sleep had completely erased my fear. My mind was empty of doubt, replaced only by a cold, animalistic need to survive. I shifted my weight, preparing to step out from behind the rubber tire and swing the heavy iron bar at the nearest guard's head, when a sudden, silent shadow detached itself from the dense tree line to my right. Before I could even react, a massive, gloved hand clamped down firmly over my mouth, shutting off my breath, while an incredibly strong arm pinned my chest against the cold metal rim of the tractor wheel. I thrashed wildly for a split second, my heart exploding in panic, believing I had been flanked by a third operator. But then, a familiar, gravelly voice whispered directly into my ear. "It's just me, Leonard. Stay perfectly still." My muscles instantly relaxed. It was Walter Higgins. He slowly let go of my mouth and crouched beside me in the deep, freezing mud, his breath misting in the cold air. He was dressed in dark, non-reflective tactical clothing that made him look like a ghost in the shadows. He did not ask if I was all right, and he did not offer any useless words of comfort. He was a veteran of Panama and Fallujah, and his mind had immediately shifted into combat mode. He simply analyzed the layout of the barn doors and the two targets with cold, clinical precision. "Two tangos," Walter whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the leaves. "They have heavy body armor and suppressed carbines. We take them simultaneously on my mark. I take the one on the left, near the keypad. You take the right, the one holding the rear guard." I nodded, my knuckles aching as I retightened my grip on the rusted iron crowbar. "Listen to me carefully, Leonard," Walter whispered, leaning closer. "Do not aim for the head or the chest. They are wearing military-grade Kevlar plates under those vests. If you swing that crowbar at his chest, it will bounce right off and give him enough time to turn and shoot you. Aim for the back of the knees. Specifically, the joint. If you strike him there with enough force, the joint will collapse instantly, dropping him to the dirt. Once he is down, I will handle the rest. Do you understand?" Walter whispered. "Kevlar is designed to disperse the energy of high-velocity bullets. It's stiff, but it doesn't protect the joints. A heavy strike to the popliteal fossa will rupture the tendons and cause the knee to buckle immediately. It's basic anatomy. Leonard, use the weight of the crowbar. Don't pull your swing. Let the iron do the work. One solid hit is all it takes." Walter reached into his jacket and pulled out a tactical combat knife, its dark blade catching no light. He checked the perimeter one last time. He had parked his own vehicle nearly half a mile down the main road, slipping onto the property through a dry creek bed to avoid alerting the SUV parked at the entrance. He had tracked these men from the moment they stepped out of their vehicle, moving through the brush like a predator. He squeezed my shoulder, a brief, solid pressure that gave me a sudden, powerful surge of confidence. I had known this man for 40 years. We had survived economic crashes, business betrayals, and personal losses. We were old men now, but we were far from helpless. Walter moved with a ghostly fluidity that defied his age. Even at 68 years old, the former Marine retained the physical grace of a predator. He glided over the wet gravel, his body low to the ground, keeping his silhouette hidden behind the low-hanging branches. I followed his lead, keeping my eyes locked on the back of my target's knee. We closed the distance, our movements covered by the howling wind and the rustling leaves. The guards were focused entirely on their task, completely unaware of the threat closing in from behind. I focused on my target. The man on the right was about 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and focused entirely on the tree line to his left. He had no idea we were behind him. I took a deep, silent breath, letting my lungs expand, and braced my legs. The mud was slick, so I had to be careful not to slip. The rusted crowbar felt balanced in my hands, a simple but lethal tool. Walter's countdown was slow, deliberate. My heart stopped racing, settling into a cold, rhythmic thrum. The wind howled, providing the perfect cover for our final rush. Walter held up 3 fingers in the pale moonlight, then 2, then 1. We moved out from the shadow of the tractor like twin shadows, our boots making no sound in the soft, wet mud. The element of absolute surprise was our only advantage, and we were going to use it to its absolute limit. We surged forward from the dark shadow of the tractor, covering the remaining 15 yards in a desperate, silent sprint. The Ojai mud was slick and freezing, threatening to throw us off balance with every step, but the sheer adrenaline driving my 70-year-old limbs kept my feet firmly planted. I locked my eyes onto the back of the right-hand guard's knee. The guard on the right must have caught a sudden shift in the wind or heard the faint crunch of gravel because he began to pivot, his head turning rapidly toward us. In the pale moonlight, I saw his eyes widen behind his black balaclava. He began to swing his suppressed submachine gun up toward my chest, but he was just a fraction of a second too late. I swung the rusted iron crowbar with all the physical strength left in my body, bringing the heavy steel down in a wide, horizontal arc. The iron collided directly with the back of the man's right knee, with a sickening wet crunch of cartilage and tendons. The guard let out a muffled, agonizing grunt as his leg completely buckled beneath him. He dropped instantly to the muddy ground like a tree being felled, his weapon slipping from his hands and clattering harmlessly against the corrugated metal siding of the barn. Even on the ground, the man was highly trained and dangerous. Despite the intense pain, he did not cry out. Instead, he immediately rolled onto his side, his left hand reaching down to unsheath a sharp tactical knife strapped to his thigh rig. I did not hesitate. I stepped forward heavily, bringing the thick heel of my heavy leather work boot down directly onto his wrist with all my weight. The bones of his wrist popped beneath my sole, pinning his hand to the freezing earth. He gasped, his fingers spasming, and the knife slipped away into the mud. Beside me, Walter was finishing his target with the clinical efficiency of a machine. Walter had closed the distance to the left guard in absolute silence. Before the man could even register his partner's fall, Walter's massive forearm wrapped tightly around his throat in a textbook rear-naked choke. Simultaneously, Walter drove his boot behind the guard's ankle, sweeping his legs out from under him. The 2 men crashed to the ground together, but Walter held the chokehold in a vice-like grip, cutting off the blood flow to the man's brain. The guard thrashed violently, his fingers clawing desperately at Walter's leather gloves, but within 10 seconds, his body went completely limp, dropping into the mud like a discarded rag doll. My target was still writhing beneath my boot, his face contorted in pain. Walter released the unconscious guard, pivoted on his knees, and dove onto my target. He delivered a single, devastating strike with the heel of his palm directly to the side of the man's jaw. The guard's eyes instantly rolled back in his head, and his body went entirely slack. The sudden, violent struggle was over in less than 30 seconds. The night returned to a dead, eerie silence, interrupted only by the ragged, wheezing sound of my own breathing. I stood there in the cold dark, my chest heaving violently, staring down at the two unconscious men lying motionless in the mud at my feet. My arms were shaking uncontrollably from the massive dump of adrenaline, and my knees felt like they were made of water. I leaned heavily against the cold metal siding of the barn, using the rusted crowbar as a cane to keep myself upright. Walter did not waste a single second celebrating our victory. He immediately reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a bundle of heavy-duty industrial plastic zip ties. He expertly rolled the first guard onto his stomach, crossing the man's wrists behind his back and pulling the thick plastic band tightly around them until it clicked securely. He did the same to the second guard, pulling the bands so tight they dug deeply into the flesh. Then, he secured their ankles together, ensuring they could not walk or fight even if they woke up. The sharp, mechanical zipping sound of the plastic cuffs was the only noise in the clearing. Walter worked with the speed of someone who had done this 1,000 times, his face completely expressionless. He didn't speak, but his eyes were constantly darting back and forth, scanning the dark woods. He checked the knots, ensuring the plastic dug deep into their wrists. They were secure, they weren't going anywhere. "Keep your eyes on the tree line," Walter muttered rapidly, patting down the tactical vests of the subdued men. "Make sure they didn't leave a driver waiting back in that SUV." I scanned the dark driveway, watching the unmoving, black silhouette of the Chevrolet Suburban parked in the distance. Nothing was moving. The headlights remained off. We were completely alone. Walter systematically stripped the men of their weapons, picking up the two suppressed submachine guns and tossing the lethal firearms far out into the tall weeds where they could not be easily retrieved. He checked their ankle holsters, confiscating two tactical knives, and then began digging through the deep pockets of their combat pants. He pulled out two encrypted cell phones, a tactical flashlight, and the biometric bypass scanner they had been trying to use. I stepped closer, aiming the beam of my maglite down at the items in the mud. "See if they have any identification," I whispered, my voice still trembling. Walter reached into the first guard's chest rig and pulled out a small, flat object. He wiped the wet mud off the surface and held it up into the flashlight beam. It was a sleek, matte black electronic keycard. The front featured a prominent stylized silver logo, a geometric V, overlapping a corporate crown. I had spent my entire life building a legacy for Julian. I had funded his private schooling, paid for his Ivy League education, and even given him the seed money to start Vance Investments. The very name of his firm was my name. Seeing that stylized V logo on the keycard of my potential murderers was a betrayal that went beyond the financial. It was a knife to the heart. He had turned my own hard work, my own name, into a weapon to destroy me. He wanted to bury his father under my own name. I felt the air leave my lungs as I stared at the silver emblem. My blood ran completely cold. I recognized that logo instantly. It was the exact emblem printed on the business cards. Julian had proudly handed me 3 months ago for his brand new off-pride investment firm in Los Angeles, Vance Investments. My own flesh and blood had dispatched his corporate security operatives to Ojai to murder me. Walter did not offer any useless words of sympathy. He simply took the matte black electronic keycard from my hand and turned toward the massive metal doors of the barn. I stood beside him, my fingers still coated in the dry rust of the crowbar, my chest tight with a cold, hollow shock. Julian's stylized corporate logo stared back at us from the plastic card. It was undeniable proof of a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical weight crushing my heart. I had built everything for him, yet he had turned my own hard work, my own name, into a weapon to destroy me. He wanted to bury his father under my own name. "Let's see what they were so eager to break into," Walter said, his voice low and tight. He shined his tactical flashlight along the wooden frame of the barn door, looking for the card reader. It was hidden with incredible skill. Behind a loose, weathered piece of rotting pine siding, right at chest height, was a small, matte black sensor. Walter pressed the keycard flat against it. A sharp electronic beep chimed, followed by the deep, heavy clack of a mechanical solenoid latch releasing. Walter gripped the edge of the sliding wooden door and pulled. Instead of grinding along rusted tracks, the heavy door rolled back with a smooth, silent fluidity. The tracks had been replaced with modern, heavy-duty industrial rollers. We shined our flashlights into the opening, and both of our breaths caught in our throats. The space between the outer wooden sliding door and the steel bulkhead was incredibly narrow, barely 3 feet. Dust motes drifted through the bright beam of my flashlight, and the air smelled of ozone, new rubber, and fresh paint, contrasting sharply with the rot of the old wood. The steel bulkhead was cool to the touch. I pressed my palm against it, feeling a slight vibration. The low-frequency hum I had heard outside was much stronger here. It was a steady, rhythmic thrumming that resonated in my chest. This barn was alive, consuming power, processing something in the dark. The inside of the structure was not filled with rotting hay, old tractors, or abandoned farming tools. Standing barely 3 feet inside the wooden threshold, completely blocking the interior of the barn, was a massive, reinforced steel bulkhead. It looked like the entrance to a military bunker or a nuclear fallout shelter. The wall was constructed from thick, sandblasted steel plates welded together with flawless precision. It featured giant, heavy-duty titanium hinges that looked capable of supporting a bank vault door, and the entire frame was sealed with thick, black industrial rubber gaskets to make it airtight. Mounted on the right side of the steel bulkhead, at eye level, was a sleek, stainless steel control panel. It featured a digital numeric keypad with a glowing blue backlight, and right above it was the bright red LED ring of a digital retinal scanner. A small LCD screen on the keypad showed a blinking cursor, waiting for an input. I stood frozen in the cold air, staring at the glowing red panel. The scale of the engineering hidden inside this rotting, decaying barn was absolutely staggering. It was a masterpiece of security, designed to withstand a major physical assault or a prolonged siege. Walter stepped past me, his combat boots making no sound on the concrete floor as he walked up to the steel wall. He ran his gloved hand along the seamless edge where the steel met the reinforced concrete frame, his face a mask of intense tactical focus. There are no external wires, no power boxes, and no physical keyholes. Walter stated quietly, his eyes examining the control panel. This is a completely closed-loop biometric security system. The keycard we took from the guards was only coded for the outer wooden door. Getting through this inner bulkhead is a different story. It requires a direct retinal scan, or a master override code entered directly into the keypad. Without the biometrics or the code, breaching this door would require shaped military-grade explosives. We don't have them, and even if we did, blowing a door this thick would collapse the entire barn structure on top of us, burying whatever is inside under tons of metal and wood. I started questioning how well I had really known my wife of 40 years. For 4 decades, I thought we had no secrets. We shared a bed, a business, and a life. But she had managed to construct a military-grade bunker without me ever noticing a single financial transaction or a single delivery truck coming to Ojai. She had operated with the stealth of a government agent. Then I remembered her early career before we met. She had audited black-budget government projects for the Department of Defense. She knew how to build things off the books. She knew how to hide money where not even the federal government could trace it. I stepped closer to the glowing red panel, my mind racing through decades of memories. Julian and Gillian clearly did not possess the required biometrics or the bypass code. That was the missing piece of the puzzle. That explained why they had sent a specialized tactical team equipped with a biometric bypass scanner and a biometric hacking device. They had been locked out. They had tried to find a way in, and when they failed, they decided to resort to high-end corporate espionage tools to force their way through. But this bunker did not belong to my son. It did not belong to the cartel, and it did not belong to Julian's new investment firm. It belonged to Eleanor. Eleanor had built this. She had designed every single detail of this subterranean fortress in absolute secrecy. And knowing Eleanor, she would have never left me completely locked out. She was a woman of order and fail-safes. She knew my technical limitations, and she knew that if she died, I would eventually find my way to this Ojai property. She would have left a key for me. A key that only I could find, and only I could understand. I closed my eyes, letting the memory of her final days wash over me. I went back to that quiet, sterile hospital room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The smell of antiseptic, the soft hum of the oxygen machine, and the rhythmic, slow beeping of the heart monitor. Eleanor lay in the bed, her body frail and exhausted by the cancer, but her eyes had remained locked on mine with a fierce, burning intensity. During those last 48 hours, she had kept whispering a specific sequence of numbers, a sequence I had foolishly dismissed as the delusions of a dying mind. I stared at the blinking cursor on the LCD screen, desperate for a solution. The system demanded a 10-digit numerical sequence. My chest tightened as a painful memory suddenly pushed its way to the forefront of my mind, a memory I had ignored for weeks. I closed my eyes and let the memory of those final, painful days in the hospital fully take over. The sterile white room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center came back to me in vivid, agonizing detail. I could still smell the sharp chemical tang of isopropyl alcohol and bleach and hear the slow, rhythmic, mechanical beep of Eleanor's heart monitor. I remembered, sitting by her bedside, holding her frail, papery hand, Julian had been standing in the corner of the room, completely detached. He was typing aggressively on his phone, his thumbs making a loud, irritating clicking sound. He had sighed heavily, checking his watch, complaining that his mother was losing her grip on reality and that we needed to hurry up and sign the remaining corporate power of attorney documents before she went completely under. At the time, I had sadly agreed with him. Eleanor's cancer had ravaged her body, and the massive doses of morphine she was receiving seemed to have eroded her brilliant mathematical mind. She was drifting in and out of consciousness, muttering quietly to herself, her eyes unfocused. But during those final, agonizing 48 hours, she had gripped my hand with a sudden, surprising strength. Her cloudy eyes had locked onto mine with a fierce, desperate intensity that I had foolishly chalked up to terminal delirium. 4, 7, 9, 2, she had whispered, her voice a dry, raspy thread. Leonard, 4, 7, 9, 2. She had repeated those 4 digits over and over again, her chest heaving with the effort. I had simply stroked her forehead, telling her to rest, telling her that everything was going to be fine. I had ignored the vital message she was desperately passing to me before her final breath. I had listened to my son, who only saw his mother as a checklist item to be completed for his financial gain. She was not losing her mind. She was leaving me the key. A profound wave of sorrow and immense, blinding clarity washed over my tired body. Eleanor had known her time was critically short. She had known that our son was a viper who could not be trusted. She had used her final moments of lucidity to give me the exact combination I needed to uncover the truth. But 4 digits were not enough. The digital interface on the steel bulkhead demanded a full 10-digit sequence. I stared at the blinking cursor, my mind racing. I needed to think exactly like Eleanor. Eleanor had always been my anchor. For 40 years, she was the calm, rational voice in my ear when the commercial deals grew too chaotic and the pressure of the business threatened to overwhelm me. Standing in front of this door, I realized the absolute depth of her love. She had foreseen the approaching storm, and she had spent her final months constructing a fortress around my life, even as her own body was failing her. It was a final, desperate act of protection. She was a woman of deep sentiment, but she always wrapped it in practical, structured logic. If she needed a 10-digit code, she would never choose a random sequence. She would combine her secret numbers with the most important date of our shared lives, a date she knew I would never, ever forget, our wedding anniversary. August 14th, 1982. As a forensic accountant, Eleanor was obsessed with standardized date formats. She spent her career auditing government books, where everything was cataloged in a 6-digit format: month, day, year. August 14, 1982, in her financial spreadsheets, was always written as 081482, that was 6 digits. Combined with the 4 secret numbers she had whispered on her deathbed, it equaled exactly 10 digits. 081482 plus 4792. Walter watched me in absolute, tense silence as I reached my trembling hand toward the glowing red keypad. The cool night air seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by a suffocating heavy tension that pressed against my chest. If I entered the wrong code, A security system this advanced would undoubtedly trigger a hard lockdown, sealing the steel door permanently and instantly alerting whoever was monitoring the security grid. The stainless steel faceplate of the control panel was cold under my fingertips. The keys were made of heavy-duty, black industrial rubber, designed to resist weathering and wear. A layer of fine Ojai dust had settled over the keypad, partially obscuring the numbers. I wiped the dust away with my sleeve, my warm breath fogging the small LCD screen for a brief second. The cursor continued to blink, its steady green light, a silent, digital reminder that we had very little time before the guards outside woke up or their partners came looking for them. I took a deep breath, letting the memory of Eleanor guide my fingers. I pressed the first 6 digits, 0, 8, 1, 4, 8, 2. The keypad emitted a series of soft, high-pitched electronic beeps, registering the numerical input. The blue backlight flickered slightly. I paused for a fraction of a second, the sweat on my forehead freezing in the cold wind, my heart hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs. I entered the final 4 numbers she had given me. 4, 7, 9, 2. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the green enter key. I pressed it down, a soft click echoing in the narrow space between the doors. I stepped back, holding my breath, for 3 agonizing, silent seconds. Absolutely nothing happened. The red optical scanner continued to blink its rhythmic, warning light. I felt a sick, hollow dread pool in my stomach, believing I had failed, believing I had miscalculated. Then, the red light on the scanner suddenly snapped off. In its place, a bright, vibrant green light illuminated the steel faceplate. A deep, heavy mechanical thud echoed from within the thick steel wall, followed immediately by the sharp hiss of depressurizing hydraulic seals. The giant titanium hinges groaned loudly as the incredibly heavy bulkhead slowly began to swing outward, releasing a sudden rush of crisp, perfectly chilled air into the dusty outer barn. Walter instantly raised his confiscated tactical knife, stepping protectively in front of me as the heavy door swung open, his eyes darting into the darkness beyond. But there was no immediate threat waiting for us. There was only the steady, rhythmic hum of high-powered electronics. We stepped cautiously over the thick steel threshold and entered a completely different world. The transition was jarring. 1 second we were standing in the muddy, freezing darkness of a ruined Ojai barn, and the next we were walking into a pristine, climate-controlled, state-of-the-art facility. The air was dry and perfectly chilled to exactly 65 degrees. The walls were lined with thick, gray soundproofing panels that entirely eliminated the howling wind outside, leaving us in a heavy insulated silence. As we walked further inside, bright LED lighting strips mounted on the ceiling automatically flickered to life, illuminating the space. Row after row of towering, matte black computer server racks stretched down the length of the rectangular concrete room. Thousands of small green and blue LED lights blinked rapidly across the advanced hardware, a digital pulse indicating they were processing a massive flow of encrypted data. Thick bundles of heavy black cables ran seamlessly from the top of the server racks, routed through overhead metal trays, and plunged directly into the concrete subfloor. This was not just a simple storage facility or a private vault. It was a highly sophisticated, multi-million-dollar off-grid data center. Evaluating commercial properties was my life's work, and my developer mind automatically began estimating the sheer cost of this subterranean construction. The excavation alone, deep beneath a functioning barn, would have required specialized contractors. The reinforced concrete walls, the industrial HVAC cooling system, the dedicated fiber optic communication lines, and the independent power substation transformer. It was easily a $3 million to $4 million engineering project. The sheer capital required to secretly build and maintain this infrastructure was astronomical. Eleanor had managed it all in absolute silence, completely out of sight of our son and the rest of the world. At the very back of the long room, past the endless rows of humming servers, stood another massive titanium structure. It was a heavily reinforced walk-in banking vault, its polished steel door gleaming under the bright overhead lights, but it was not the towering servers, the blinking lights, or the imposing vault that caught my attention. sitting perfectly centered on a polished stainless steel desk in the middle of the room. Directly under a single overhead spotlight was a pristine white paper envelope. I walked slowly down the central aisle between the humming server racks, my heavy work boots making a sharp, hollow sound against the polished concrete floor. As I approached the desk, the bold, elegant handwriting across the envelope came into sharp, undeniable focus. It was written in thick black ink, addressed simply, "For my beloved husband, Leonard." My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely pick the envelope up from the stainless steel surface. The thick, high-quality paper felt incredibly heavy, carrying the weight of a ghost speaking to me from beyond the grave. I ran my thumb over my name, tracing the familiar, flowing curves of Eleanor's handwriting. Beside me, Walter remained a stoic, silent guardian. He moved away from the desk, positioning himself strategically near the open steel bulkhead, his hand resting on his weapon as his eyes constantly scanned the darkened interior of the barn outside. He knew exactly what this moment meant to me, and he was ensuring that I had the uninterrupted time I desperately needed to face whatever was inside that envelope. I took a deep, ragged breath, letting the clean, filtered air of the bunker fill my burning lungs, and carefully broke the red wax seal on the back of the envelope. The wax seal was stamped with Eleanor's signature mark, a stylized compass rose. The wax snapped with a crisp, sharp sound, releasing a faint scent of lavender, the perfume she had worn for 40 years. I unfolded the thick parchment paper inside. The date at the top of the page was written exactly 3 weeks before she was admitted to the hospital for her final, fatal decline. The ink was slightly smudged in the corners, as if her hand had been trembling or she had been crying while writing the words. I swallowed the thick, painful knot forming in my throat and began to read her letter in the quiet hum of the servers. "My dearest Leonard," she began, the words flooding my heart with a profound, agonizing sorrow. "If you are standing in this room, it means my absolute worst fears have been realized. It means I am gone, and it means you have finally followed the breadcrumbs I left behind to uncover the horrible truth about our family. Please forgive my deception, my love. I have spent the last 2 years hiding the truth from you, keeping you in the dark. I did it because I needed to protect you, and the only way to keep you safe from the crossfire was to make you look like a harmless, ignorant old man in the eyes of our enemies." I gripped the parchment paper tighter, the ink blurred by my own tears as I read the detailed confession of my late wife. Eleanor's brilliant, logical mind was alive on these pages, tracing a financial nightmare that I had been completely blind to. 2 years ago, Julian asked me to review the initial financial ledgers for Vance Investments. Eleanor wrote, her elegant script cutting deep into my heart. He thought I would just glance at the top-line profit margins, smile, and congratulate him on his quick success in the financial world. But I am a forensic accountant, Leonard. I don't look at summaries, I look at the foundations. I followed the money trails. I tracked the complex routing numbers, the wire transfers from offshore shell companies registered in Panama and the Cayman Islands, and the layered dummy accounts he and Gillian were aggressively setting up. Our son is not a legitimate investment banker, Leonard. He and Gillian are running a massive, highly sophisticated money laundering operation for a notorious international drug cartel. They have been filtering millions of dollars of illicit drug money through the Southern California luxury real estate market, and, worst of all, they were quietly planning to use your development company as their primary washing machine. They wanted to inject their dirty cash into your construction projects, blending it with your clean assets until your life's work was completely poisoned. A wave of intense, icy nausea washed over my body, and I had to lean against the steel desk to steady my legs. The puzzle pieces were falling into place with a sickening thud. The sudden, aggressive transfer of the luxury penthouse, the will reading, the private security guards, and the unmarked white tablets Gillian had handed me. I knew that if I confronted Julian directly, the letter continued, he would panic and try to silence me. The people he is working for are incredibly violent, and they do not tolerate mistakes or leaks. So I played the role of a declining, paranoid mother suffering from early cognitive decline. I let them believe I was losing my grip on reality. Meanwhile, I used my extensive financial network to secretly liquidate the vast majority of our liquid family assets. Over the course of 18 months, I quietly sold off our stock portfolios, our mutual funds, and our foreign investments. I converted over $80 million into untraceable, physical bearer bonds, secure mineral rights, and gold patents. I hid the true family fortune right here in this vault, entirely out of his reach. I left him the downtown penthouse and the active bank accounts in the will to serve as a shiny distraction, a temporary pacifier to keep him and Gillian occupied while I finished securing our real wealth. He thinks he won, Leonard. He thinks he outsmarted his aging mother and walked away with the crown jewel, but he only took the bait. I read the next paragraph, my breath catching sharply in my throat as Eleanor explained the legal trap she had engineered. You might wonder why I did not leave the penthouse to you, my love. It was our home, the place we built together. But the penthouse is no longer a safe asset. Julian and Gillian have fully, dangerously leveraged it. They have taken out multiple high-interest loans against the property using forged documents, and they have tied the address directly to the cartel's money laundering hub. If I had left the penthouse in your name, you would have inherited a massive illegal liability. The moment the federal investigators audit the property, and they will, because I have been quietly feeding anonymous tips to the cybercrimes division of the FBI, would have been the sole owner listed on the deed. The feds would have arrested you, frozen all your assets under the RICO Act, and thrown you into a maximum security prison for the rest of your life. Or worse, the cartel would have targeted you to cover their tracks. By altering my will to leave the penthouse entirely to Julian, I legally bound him to his own criminal enterprise. I removed your name from the blast radius, protecting you from both the federal prosecutors and the cartel enforcers. I gave him the penthouse to let him hang himself with his own rope. He has inherited the liability, and you have inherited the fortune. I stared at the paper, a single tear slipping down my cheek and landing on the ink. The profound depth of Eleanor's love and protection was staggering. While she was fighting a terminal illness, suffering through the agonizing physical decline of cancer, she had spent her final months executing a financial masterclass to shield me from our own son. She had quietly borne Julian's insults, his sighs of disgust in the hospital, and his arrogant dismissal of her mind, all to ensure that I would survive. Open the vault, Leonard, the letter concluded, her handwriting growing slightly larger and firmer. The code to the safe is our wedding anniversary combined with the 4 secret numbers I whispered to you. Inside, you will find the bearer bonds and the routing numbers for the offshore trusts. Use this wealth to rebuild your life. Do not let Julian destroy your future. I have also left a failsafe on the server. If they ever track you to Ojai, if they ever try to force their way into this bunker, use the executable file on the main terminal. It is a dead man's switch. It will immediately upload the complete forensic records and video evidence to the DEA and the FBI. I love you, Leonard. Protect yourself and trust Walter. He is the only one who can help you now. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket, right next to my heart. The overwhelming grief that had suffocated me for the past month was gone, burned away by a cold, righteous fury. Julian was not just an ungrateful, greedy son. He was a monster who had betrayed his family, money laundered for killers, and tried to execute his own father to secure a stolen fortune. But Eleanor had handed me the ultimate weapon to destroy him. I walked over to the main computer terminal, sitting on the stainless steel desk, my legs heavy and trembling. The dual high-definition monitors glowed with a soft blue light, casting long shadows across the server racks. I sat down in the ergonomic mesh chair, my hands hovering over the mechanical keyboard. I pressed the spacebar, and the screens instantly woke up, displaying a clean, highly customized Linux desktop environment. Eleanor had organized the files with the same meticulous, logic-driven structure she used in her accounting audits. In the center of the desktop was a single, highlighted directory labeled Prosecution Evidence. I clicked the folder open. Inside were several subfolders, each packed with documents, spreadsheets, and encrypted archives. I saw files labeled Vance, Investments Laundering Audit, PDF, Cartel Transaction Locks.less, and Offshore Shell, Entities.zep. But the folder that made my heart freeze was labeled simply Cedar Sinai Room 402 Security Lock. I double-clicked the folder. Inside was a single video file, timestamped October 12, 2025 at 2:15 a.m., the exact date and time of Eleanor's sudden, unexpected death. The file name was Room 402 Hidden Feed.mp4. My hand shook so violently I could barely position the cursor over the file. I clicked play. The media player loaded, displaying a grainy, high-contrast, infrared night vision feed. The camera angle was low, positioned from the bedside table, disguised as a standard digital clock radio. It captured the entire hospital room, including the bed where Eleanor lay sleeping, her frail body hooked up to the IV lines and the oxygen machine. The night vision feed made Eleanor's skin look like polished, white marble. The IV tube was a thin, dark line connecting her arm to the tall metal pole. The display on the heart monitor was a bright, blinking box that cast a pale green glow over her sleeping face. Seeing Gillian's hands, the same hands that had served me dinner in the luxury penthouse last week. Injecting poison into my wife's veins was a psychological horror that made my stomach turn. I wanted to scream, to reach through the screen and tear her away, but I was forced to watch the tragedy unfold in silence. For the first 2 minutes, the video was silent, showing nothing but the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Eleanor's chest. But then, the heavy wooden door of the hospital room slowly swung open. 2 figures stepped into the dark room. It was 2:15 in the morning. They were not doctors, and they were not nurses. It was Julian and Gillian. They moved with a quiet, stealthy coordination that instantly made my skin crawl. Julian stood near the door, his eyes locked on the hallway outside, his body tense as he kept watch. Gillian walked directly to the side of the hospital bed. In the green, infrared light, her face was completely devoid of emotion, a mask of chilling clinical coldness. Gillian had studied pharmacology at the University of Southern California before she married Julian. She knew exactly how chemical compounds interacted with the human body. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a small, pre-filled glass syringe and a vial of clear liquid. Julian checked his watch, whispering something to her. Gillian nodded, her lips moving in a quiet, hushed response that was captured by the camera's microphone. "This will look like natural organ failure," she whispered, her voice devoid of any human empathy. "The morphine in her system will mask the chemical imbalance. The doctors won't even order an autopsy." Gillian reached down, took hold of the primary port on Eleanor's IV line, and injected the clear liquid directly into the tube. Within 30 seconds, Eleanor's body began to twitch violently. The heart rate monitor on the screen began to beep frantically, the numbers spiking into a dangerous, lethal zone. Eleanor gasps, her head turning, her fingers clawing at the bed sheets in a desperate, silent struggle for air. She looked directly toward the camera, directly toward me. Julian was my only son. I had funded his private schooling, paid for his Ivy League education, and given him the seed money to start Vance Investments. I was there when he took his first steps. And now I was watching him take his mother's last breaths. The absolute coldness in his eyes was the most terrifying part of the video. He did not look sad or angry or even nervous about what they were doing. He looked bored. He looked like he was simply waiting for a tedious business meeting to end, checking his watch as his mother flatlined. Julian did not move to help her. He did not run to the door to call for medical assistance. He simply stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, watching his own mother die in agony. Gillian kept her hand pressed against Eleanor's arm, holding her down, waiting until the frantic beeping of the heart monitor slowly decelerated, transitioning into a solid, high-pitched flatline. The video ended, looping back to the initial black screen. I sat there in the quiet hum of the data center, staring blankly at the dark monitor. A tear of absolute blinding agony slipped down my cheek, followed by a wave of cold, consuming fury. The grief that had hollowed out my chest for the past month was instantly replaced by a deep, righteous rage. My son had not just abandoned me. He and Gillian had actively, brutally murdered my wife to secure a fortune they believed she was hiding. Leonard. Walter's gravelly voice suddenly shattered the silence of the bunker. I turned my head slowly, my eyes red and burning. Walter was standing near the open steel bulkhead, his face tense as he stared at the security monitors mounted above the entrance. The monitors displayed live feeds from the outdoor security cameras. Eleanor had hidden in the trees. "We have a problem," Walter said, his tone shifting into immediate, tactical alert. The SUV parked at the entrance just snapped its headlights back on. It's moving down the driveway toward the barn. And they're not alone. I count 3 more targets stepping out of a second vehicle behind it. They have heavy equipment. They are carrying a thermal lance. Walter pointed to the middle screen. The hidden outdoor cameras showed the black Suburban pulling up to the side of the barn, its headlights cutting through the oak trees. Behind it, a white panel van had pulled up. 3 more men in tactical gear were unloading heavy pressurized gas cylinders and a long copper-tipped thermal lance. A thermal lance uses pressurized oxygen and steel rods to create a chemical flame hotter than 8,000 degrees, capable of burning through a 4-inch steel bulkhead in minutes. They were bringing the heavy artillery. They knew the biometrics had failed, and they were going to burn their way in. Walter did not hesitate. He threw his entire body weight against the massive open steel bulkhead door, swinging the heavy titanium-welded structure shut. With a sharp, heavy mechanical clack, the door settled perfectly into its reinforced concrete frame. He grabbed the large, circular steel locking wheel in the center of the door and rotated it aggressively clockwise, driving 3 massive 5-inch steel locking bolts deep into the surrounding concrete walls. The heavy industrial rubber gaskets compressed completely, creating an airtight, hermetically sealed vault. The sound of the heavy steel locking bolts sliding into the concrete frame was deafening in the enclosed space. It was the sound of absolute safety. I let out a long, shuddering breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We were sealed inside a steel womb, protected by 4 inches of armor plate. "We are secure for now," Walter said, his breathing steady but fast. He walked quickly to the security monitor array, his eyes scanning the live video feeds. On the middle monitor, the 3 newly arrived tactical operators had entered the wooden barn. They moved with the same professional fluidity as the first crew. They stopped cold when they spotted their 2 zip-tied, unconscious partners lying in the mud, dragging them out of the barn and propping them up against the tractor tire. Then, they immediately focused on the steel bulkhead. One of the operators was wearing a heavy, customized backpack containing pressurized oxygen cylinders connected to a long, 10-foot-long copper-tipped thermal lance. He adjusted the regulator valves, struck a spark, and a blinding white-hot chemical flame instantly erupted from the tip of the lance. The blue and white glare was incredibly intense, casting harsh, dramatic shadows across the wooden walls of the barn. He brought the white-hot flame, burning at over 8,000 degrees, directly against the center of our steel door. A massive shower of bright orange sparks erupted, bouncing violently off the concrete floor. Even through the thick, insulated bulkhead, we could hear the faint, low-pitched roar of the chemical combustion. Within 2 minutes, a small, circular red spot began to form in the center of our steel door, glowing brighter and brighter as the intense heat slowly conducted through the metal. A faint smell of heated steel and burning paint began to seep through the ventilation shafts, and the temperature inside the data center started to rise slightly. "The steel plate is 4 inches thick," Walter stated, his voice calm, analytical. "But a thermal lance combines burning iron rods with pure oxygen. It melts through steel like wax. At this rate, they will have a hole big enough to bypass the locking mechanism in about 10 minutes. We have to prepare for a breach." Walter walked quickly to the back of the server room, stopped in front of a heavy wall-mounted gun safe, hidden behind a false metal cabinet panel, and pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner. The scanner beeped green and the heavy door clicked open. Eleanor had programmed his print into the database, proving she trusted him completely with our lives. He reached inside and pulled out 2 tactical, semi-automatic Benelli M4 shotguns, their matte black barrels and synthetic stocks catching the light. He handed one of the weapons to me, along with a heavy box of 12-gauge double buckshot ammunition. The Benelli M4 was a masterpiece of military engineering, the standard-issue combat shotgun of the United States Marine Corps. It was gas-operated, incredibly reliable under the harshest conditions, and capable of firing 6 rounds of heavy buckshot in less than 2 seconds. The synthetic stock was rubberized to absorb the heavy recoil, and the ghost ring sights were designed for rapid target acquisition in low-light environments. "Do you remember how to use this, Leonard?" Walter asked. His eyes locked on mine. I took the shotgun, feeling the cold, solid weight of the weapon in my hands. "I haven't fired a shotgun in 20 years, Walter," I replied, my voice steadying. "But my father taught me how to hunt when I was a teenager. Some things you never forget." "Good," Walter said, his gravelly voice firm. "It's simple. Load the shells into the magazine tube under the barrel. Pull the charging handle back to chamber around, push the safety off, and pull the trigger. The spread of the zero buckshot will do the rest in a confined space like this. If they breach that door, they will have to come through a narrow opening one at a time. We hold the choke point." One by one, I pushed the heavy red plastic shells into the magazine tube, hearing a series of sharp, metallic clicks as they slid into place. 5 shells in the tube, 1 in the chamber. The physical act of loading the weapon gave me a strange, powerful sense of control. I was no longer a victim waiting to be slaughtered. I was armed, defended, and backed by a professional soldier. But as I looked back at the glowing computer monitors, seeing the red hotspot on the door expanding, I realized I did not want this to end in a bloody gunfight. I did not want to just shoot these mercenaries and bury the bodies. I wanted to destroy Julian and Gillian completely. I wanted to use the ultimate weapon Eleanor had left for me. On the secondary monitor, I saw the executable file labeled manstitch.exe sitting on the Linux desktop. "I have a better plan, Walter," I said, setting the shotgun down on the stainless steel desk. "We don't need to shoot them. We need to talk to them first." "Talk to them?" Walter frowned, his hand resting on the receiver of his M4. "They are mercenaries, Leonard. They don't negotiate." "They don't," I replied, a cold, dark smile spreading across my face. "But my son does, and I'm going to make him an offer he cannot refuse." I reached across the stainless steel desk and flipped a series of heavy toggle switches on the audio console. Eleanor had installed a high-powered, weather-resistant public address system with large horn speakers mounted securely under the eaves of the barn roof. She had built a way for the bunker's occupant to communicate with the outside world. I pulled the microphone close to my face, adjusting the volume slider. Next, I picked up one of the encrypted cell phones we had confiscated from the zip-tied guards outside. The phone was unlocked, displaying a direct speed dial contact labeled Control. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear. The phone rang 3 times before Julian picked up. The connection was crystal clear, capturing the ambient noise of his high-rise luxury penthouse. I could hear the wind whistling against the thick, double-paned glass windows of the 35th floor, overlooking the sparkling lights of downtown Los Angeles. Julian was in his element, surrounded by wealth he hadn't earned, sipping a 30-year-old single malt scotch. He had no idea that his world was about to crash down around him. "Is the package delivered? Is the old man gone?" "No, Julian," I said, speaking slowly and clearly into the phone. "The package is very much alive, and I am looking right at your business cards." The line went completely, dead silent. The clinking of the ice cubes stopped instantly. I could hear Julian's breathing hitch, his smug composure shattering in a fraction of a second. "Dad?" he stammered, his voice laced with a sudden sharp panic. How are you on this line? Where are my men?" I flipped the toggle switch on the console, routing my microphone directly to the external PA speakers. When I spoke next, my voice boomed across the Ojai, echoing loudly off the surrounding mountains and roaring through the wooden barn outside. "Your men are currently lying zip-tied in the freezing mud, Julian," I said, my voice carrying a cold, echoing authority. "And your second crew is currently trying to burn through a 4-inch steel bulkhead door with a thermal lance. But they are wasting their time. I am inside Eleanor's bunker, and I have absolutely everything." On the security monitor, I watched the 3 tactical operators outside freeze. The loud, roaring flame of the thermal lance suddenly sputtered and died, as the man holding the torch lowered it, looking up toward the rafters in absolute confusion. They were hearing my voice booming from the sky, realizing the entire operation had been compromised. They began to slowly back away from the door. Outside, the mercenaries were already throwing their gear back into the white panel van. They were professionals, and they knew when a mission was lost. The moment my voice had boomed through the PA speakers, announcing that federal networks had been notified, they recognized that they had no more time. Staying on site meant facing a federal tactical response unit. They abandoned the thermal lance, leaving it cooling in the mud, jumped into the Suburban and sped down the driveway, leaving Julian's zip-tied corporate enforcers behind. Julian let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh over the phone receiver, trying desperately to regain control of the conversation. "You have nothing, old man. You are a senile, grieving wreck. The police won't believe a word you say. We have the legal deeds to the penthouse, we have the probate documents, and we have the courts. You're finished." "I am not talking about the real estate deeds, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to an icy, quiet whisper that was amplified by the towering speakers. "I am talking about the security footage from room 402 at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The hidden camera feed from October 12th, at 2:15 in the morning. I just watched you and Gillian inject concentrated poison into your mother's IV line. I watched her die while you checked your watch." A sharp, terrified shriek erupted in the background of the call. It was Gillian. She had been hovering near the phone, listening, and the realization that their perfect murder had been captured on video had completely broken her. "Julian," she screamed, her voice cracking in pure terror. "He knows! He has the video! We have to get out of here!" Julian tried to stammer out a frantic series of excuses. "Dad, you don't understand the pressure I was under," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "The cartel, they threatened Gillian. They threatened our lives if we didn't get them the money. We had no choice. We had to leverage the penthouse. Mother was going to go to the police. She was going to ruin everything. We did it to protect the family name. We were going to pay it back, I swear." "There are no deals, Julian," I said, my hand resting flat on the mechanical keyboard of the computer terminal. The cursor was hovering directly over the executable file labeled Died Man. Sheech Exe. "This is a compiled Python script," I explained, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. "It has a secure socket connection to an encrypted cloud database. The moment I press the Enter key, it will instantly upload 40 gigabytes of data, including the high-definition footage of your mother's murder, the complete forensic audit of Vance Investments, and the cartel's offshore bank routing numbers, directly to the DEA, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the Cyber Crimes Division of the FBI. The transmission cannot be stopped and it cannot be recalled. Dad, please. I'm your son. I'm your own flesh and blood." Julian sobbed, his voice breaking over the static of the line. "If you send that, we'll go to prison for life. The cartel will kill us. Please, Dad, I beg you. You stopped being my son the moment you stood by and watched your mother suffocate to death for a stack of paper," I said. I looked at the blinking green button on the screen. "This is for Eleanor." I slammed my finger down on the Enter key. The computer monitors instantly flared with a rapid sequence of cascading code, and a progress bar appeared on the screen, filling to 100% in a fraction of a second. A bold, white alert box appeared in the center of the display. "Transmission complete." Federal networks nodded. "Emergency response." Grid activated. I hung up the phone, threw the plastic device onto the desk, and leaned back in the chair. The final trap had been sprung, and there was absolutely no escape. The silence that returned to the data vault was absolute. On the computer terminal, the progress bar remained locked at 100%, a digital tombstone marking the end of Julian's corporate empire and his freedom. I leaned back in the mesh chair, my muscles completely limp, my mind empty of thoughts. The physical and emotional exhaustion of the night had caught up to me, leaving me numb. Beside me, Walter kept his shotgun raised, his eyes locked on the door monitors. Because of Eleanor's extensive, year-long preparation, the federal response was almost instantaneous. She had spent 18 months building the case, quietly feeding the FBI Cyber Division and the DEA detailed transaction logs, offshore account numbers, and cartel communication threads. The authorities had already been staging a massive operation nearby in Ventura County, waiting for the final, undeniable piece of concrete evidence to execute their warrants. The transmission of the hospital murder video was the catastrophic catalyst they needed. Within 15 minutes, the security monitors displayed a chaotic, blinding array of flashing red and blue lights tearing up the Ojai driveway. Heavy, armored Bearcat vehicles and black federal SUVs plowed through the mud, their headlights cutting through the dark eucalyptus trees. Simultaneously, the deep, rhythmic roar of two Black Hawk helicopters echoed from the sky. The twin Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters hovered barely 50 feet above the tree line, their dark hulls silhouetted against the morning sky. The deafening roar of their powerful turboshaft engines vibrated through the concrete floor beneath my boots. The intent downwash from their four-blade rotors bent the ancient oak branches, creating a storm of dry eucalyptus leaves and gravel that swirled through the blinding searchlights. It was an overwhelming display of federal power, a tactical hammer falling on Julian's operation. OSWAT teams in full tactical gear, wearing OD green plate carriers and ballistic helmets, surged out of the vehicles with their weapons raised. The remaining enforcers outside did not even attempt to fight. Recognizing the sheer scale of the federal force, they threw their hands up, dropped their weapons into the mud, and knelt. They were pushed face down into the cold earth and handcuffed. Julian's corporate enforcers, still zip-tied near the old tractor tire, were hauled to their feet and thrown into the back of transport vans. Walter walked over to the terminal and flipped a switch, routing a local news broadcast onto the secondary monitor. Within minutes of the raid, the media had already picked up the story of a massive, simultaneous federal sweep across Southern California. Breaking news out of Los Angeles, the news anchor reported. The screen showing live footage of FBI agents carrying boxes of files out of the downtown Vance Investments offices. The Department of Justice has announced the total dismantling of Vance Investments, a high-profile real estate firm in downtown LA. Corporate executive Julian Vance and his wife Gillian Vance have been arrested in the parking garage of their luxury penthouse. Authorities state they were attempting to flee the country with suitcases containing over $5 million in cash and forged passports. They are currently being held without bail, facing federal RICO money laundering charges, tax evasion, and state charges of first-degree murder in connection with the death of Eleanor Vance. Agent Crawford explained the details of the LA arrest. Julian and Gillian had panicked after I hung up the phone. They had emptied their wall safe, packed leather duffel bags with cash and passports, and rushed down to the parking garage to get into their Mercedes-Benz. But the FBI had already blockaded the exits. When Julian saw the tactical teams, he had tried to throw the car in reverse, crashing violently into a concrete pillar. They were dragged out of the vehicle and slammed onto the greasy concrete, their dreams of escaping to a non-extradition country completely shattered. The screen cut to a live feed of the parking garage, showing Julian and Gillian, their hands cuffed behind their backs, being pushed into the rear of a black SUV. Julian's face was white, his expensive suit covered in dirt, his eyes wide with a hollow, terrified shock. Gillian was weeping hysterically, her head bowed. The luxury penthouse, the symbol of their greed and betrayal, had been seized by the federal government under asset forfeiture laws. I watched the screen, feeling no joy, no satisfaction, and no victory. There was only a quiet, solemn peace. The monster who had murdered my wife was going to spend the rest of his life behind bars, destroyed by the very mother he had dismissed as senile. "Let's go, Leonard," Walter said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder. "The feds are waiting for us." Walter rotated the locking wheel counterclockwise, disengaging the heavy steel bolts, and pushed the massive bulkhead door open. We stepped out of the sterile, air-conditioned data center and walked through the wooden barn doors, stepping out into the cool, fresh morning air of Ojai. The sun was just beginning to over the ridgeline, casting a warm golden light over the valley. The thick fog was slowly lifting off the mountains, revealing a clean, bright sky. The Ojai clearing was packed with federal agents, police cruisers, and forensic vans. A tall, middle-aged woman in a dark blue FBI windbreaker walked toward us, her gold badge catching the morning sun. It was Special Agent Crawford. She stopped in front of us, looking at me with a serious, respectful expression. "Mr. Vance," Agent Crawford said, extending her hand. "I'm Special Agent Crawford, FBI Cybercrimes. We've been receiving your wife's files for over a year. I wanted to tell you, Eleanor was a genius. The forensic audit she compiled on Vance Investments was a masterpiece. She built a case that the Department of Justice couldn't ignore. She saved your life, and she brought down a multi-million-dollar money laundering pipeline. I am incredibly sorry for your loss, but justice has been served." I shook her hand, my eyes misting. "Thank you, Agent," I whispered. "She did it to protect us." 6 months have passed since that freezing, violent night in the Ojai mud. The dust has finally settled, and the wheels of justice have ground forward with a slow, crushing finality. Julian and Gillian did not even attempt to fight the charges in court. Faced with the overwhelming, airtight forensic evidence Eleanor had compiled, along with the undeniable high-definition video of the hospital room poisoning, they accepted a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty under California law. They both pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and federal RICO money laundering. They are currently serving consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole in separate, maximum-security federal penitentiaries. The luxury downtown penthouse in Los Angeles was permanently seized by the government, sold at federal auction to pay off their massive corporate debts, and the accounts of Vance Investments were liquidated. The cartel network they had been laundering money for has been systematically dismantled by a multi-agency federal task force, leaving their criminal empire in ruins. The news of Julian's arrest had sent massive shockwaves through the Los Angeles business community. Vance Investments was revealed to be a complete sham, its books packed with fraudulent transactions and money laundering schemes. Julian's name was dragged through the dirt, his reputation entirely destroyed. He went from a high-flying real estate mogul to federal prisoner number 84792, locked away in a concrete cell, abandoned by his corporate friends and his cartel handlers, who immediately cut all ties to him. I stood in the center of the Ojai clearing, the warm afternoon sun shining down on a completely transformed landscape. The old, decaying farmhouse and the fake wooden barn have been completely demolished. The splintered pine wood, the pea-filling floral paper, and the water-damaged linoleum were swept away by bulldozers, and the ground was cleared. In their place stood a beautiful, state-of-the-art modern sanctuary. The main building of Eleanor's Haven was a low-slung, single-story ranch style, designed to be completely accessible for seniors with mobility issues. The walls were constructed from local Ojai riverstone, blending seamlessly with the natural oak landscape. Inside, the vaulted ceilings were made of warm, reclaimed redwood, and massive skylights flooded the hallways with natural sunlight. The air inside was clean and fresh, smelling of pine and lavender, a subtle loving nod to Eleanor's favorite scent. It is a retirement retreat called Eleanor's Haven, funded entirely by the $80 million family fortune recovered from the titanium vault. The architecture is sleek, modern, and open, constructed from natural stone and glass, featuring massive solar panel arrays and expansive windows that overlook the valley. Wide concrete pathways wind through community gardens, fruit orchards, and quiet seating areas shaded by towering oak and eucalyptus trees. Eleanor's Haven is a free nonprofit sanctuary for low-income seniors and retired military veterans who were priced out of California's soaring housing market. Today, we have exactly 45 residents, retired school teachers, combat veterans, and elderly couples who had spent their lives working hard, only to find themselves struggling in their golden years. Here, they have a secure, beautiful place to live out their lives in absolute dignity, with their housing, meals, and medical care fully paid for by the offshore trusts Eleanor had meticulously set up. I watched Walter walk along the central pathway, a simple blue polo shirt replacing his dark combat gear. The shirt featured a small, embroidered silver compass rose emblem over his chest. He was chatting warmly with a retired Navy veteran near the community garden, but his sharp, alert eyes still swept the perimeter of the property out of habit. He had taken the job as the sanctuary's head of security, ensuring that our residents would always be safe. I walked over to a polished wooden bench at the edge of the clearing, sitting down as the sun began its final descent over the ridge. The Ojai Valley was experiencing what the locals call the pink moment, a breathtaking, brief period at sunset where the Topa Mountains glow in brilliant shades of pink, orange, and deep purple. The beauty of the valley was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the dark, freezing tomb the farm had represented just 6 months ago. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Eleanor's silver pendant. The compass rose, catching the last golden rays of the sun. I ran my thumb over the polished metal, feeling a deep, quiet connection to the woman who had saved my life. I looked at the compass rose pendant in my hand. It was a simple piece of jewelry I had bought her for our 10th anniversary, but she had worn it every day since. She always told me that a compass doesn't just show you where north is. It shows you how to find your way home when you're lost in the dark. For the past month, I was lost. I was drowning in grief, in betrayal, in anger. But she had guided me through the storm, leaving me a path to follow. I spent 35 years of my life building massive commercial skyscrapers, buying up land, and managing large real estate portfolios. I had foolishly believed that a man's legacy and worth were measured in square footage, interest rates, and the size of his bank accounts. I had raised a son who shared those exact empty values. A son who was willing to poison his own mother and execute his own father to secure a penthouse and a laundered corporate fortune. But a true legacy is not constructed from steel, glass, and concrete. It is built from love, protection, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Eleanor had understood that. She had looked past the corporate boards and the financial contracts. She had seen the poison spreading in our son's heart, and she had spent her final, painful months executing a masterclass of financial strategy and legal defense to shield me from the blast radius. She had sacrificed her relationship with her own child, suffered through his insults, and died in pain, all to ensure that her husband would survive. I held the compass rose tight in my palm, looking out over the peaceful valley, watching the lights of the sanctuary slowly blink on. The residents were gathering in the dining hall, their laughter echoing softly through the open windows. Eleanor's legacy did not end in a federal prison or a seized penthouse. It was alive right here in the safety, warmth, and dignity of the people she was protecting. I took a deep, clean breath of the mountain air and closed my eyes, a peaceful smile finally spreading across my face. I was finally home. The line went dead.